In the chaos of World War II, when battles raged across Europe and the Pacific, a quiet and unexpected story was unfolding on American soil, one that very few people know about today. While millions of American soldiers were fighting overseas, the United States became home to more than 400,000 Axis prisoners of war. They were mostly German and Italian soldiers, men who had once fought fiercely for their nations, but now found themselves far from the front lines, living behind fences in places that might surprise you. Among the many states that hosted these prisoners, Minnesota played an extraordinary role. Imagine the contrast. Young men who had once marched across Europe under Nazi banners now found themselves gazing out over the wide fields of the American Midwest, instead of crumbling ruins or smoking battlefields. They woke each morning to the sound of farm life, cows lowing, corn rustling in the wind, and tractors humming in the distance. To many Americans, the thought of enemy soldiers living so close to their communities felt unsettling, even dangerous. Yet over time, these camps became the stage for something remarkable, not just survival, but human connection. The U.S. agreed to take in these POWs partly out of necessity. Britain and other allied nations simply could not handle the overwhelming number of captured soldiers. But what happened next was far from what the world expected. Under the rules of the 1929 Geneva Convention, these men were given food, medical care, and shelter. They were not left to rot in misery. Instead, they were put to work, primarily in agriculture, filling the massive labor gap left behind when American men shipped out to fight. It is easy to picture the scene. German prisoners bent over rows of sugar beets or stacking hay in barns, watched over not by harsh guards with whips, but by American farmers who relied on their labor to keep the nation fed. Over time, curiosity replaced fear. Locals who had once eyed the camps with suspicion began to see the humanity in the men behind the barbed wire. And, for the prisoners, Minnesota was unlike anything they could have imagined. What unfolded here is a story about unexpected bonds and the strange ways war can bring people together. Friendships were born in the most unlikely of circumstances. Letters were exchanged, photos shared, and in some cases, even love blossomed between former enemies. These stories remain largely hidden from mainstream history, but they carry lessons about resilience, compassion, and the power of human connection in times of unimaginable conflict. Today, as we look back, these untold stories challenge the way we think about war and peace. They remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, acts of humanity can shine through. And perhaps most importantly, they show us how choices made in the heat of conflict can echo for generations. If you find these hidden chapters of history as fascinating as we do, make sure to hit the like button, share this video with friends who love learning about the past, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful, forgotten stories. Your support helps us continue to uncover the histories that textbooks often leave behind. Together, let us bring these voices back into the light. The United States had not originally set out to become the guardian of hundreds of thousands of captured enemy soldiers. Yet circumstances pushed the nation into that role. By the middle of the war, Allied forces in Europe were winning key battles and taking prisoners by the tens of thousands. Britain, already stretched to the limit by years of bombardment, rationing, and housing shortages, simply did not have the capacity to detain such massive numbers of enemy troops. Prisoner compounds were overcrowded, supplies were strained, and the logistical nightmare of keeping so many men secure threatened to spiral out of control. A decision was made, one that would carry profound consequences, not just for the men captured, but also for the communities half a world away that would one day host them. The United States, with its vast land, abundant resources, and relative safety from frontline combat, agreed to take them in. It is difficult to imagine the sheer scale of what this meant. Picture convoys of ships crossing the Atlantic, no longer just carrying American soldiers to war, but now ferrying back the very men those soldiers had fought against. Thousands of uniformed prisoners, their faces lined with fatigue, were transported across the ocean and scattered across American heartland states like Minnesota, where the fields stretched endlessly and the war felt distant. For many of these men, stepping off the train onto American soil was disorienting. They were thousands of miles away from home, prisoners in the land of their enemies, unsure of what awaited them. For Americans, too, the arrival of these men was unsettling. Communities that had sent their own sons to Europe to fight suddenly learned that enemy soldiers would be housed in camps just a few miles down the road. Mothers who worried daily about letters from the front found it hard to reconcile that captured Germans would be eating, working, and living on American farms. Yet as strange as it seemed, the situation was not only practical, it was necessary. The American war machine required food, labor, and order, and with so many young men gone, farmers and factories faced crippling shortages. These prisoners, instead of being left idle, became an unexpected answer to that problem. Minnesota, with its agricultural wealth, became one of the many states to host these men. Camps were built near farmland, their fences blending into the rolling hills and flat plains. Guards patrolled the perimeters, but inside the fences, life for the prisoners took on a rhythm far different from the chaos they had left behind in Europe. They worked long hours in the fields, harvesting crops and assisting in labor that kept the state's economy running. Though they were prisoners, they were not treated with cruelty. The Geneva Convention ensured that they were given food, clothing, and shelter, and though not luxurious, it was a level of care that surprised many of them. For the United States, hosting these men also carried another strategic purpose. Humane treatment of prisoners was not only a legal obligation but a psychological weapon. Word would travel back through captured soldiers that surrendering to Americans was not a death sentence, nor a descent into starvation and abuse, but a chance to survive the war with dignity intact. In fact, many German soldiers later admitted that they chose to lay down their arms because they knew of the reputation of American camps. In this way, Minnesota's quiet fields and small towns became unlikely instruments in the larger Allied strategy to weaken enemy resistance. The prisoners themselves lived in a strange limbo. They were far removed from the front lines, yet the war still shaped every aspect of their existence. Barbed wire surrounded them. Guards stood watch, but the fields they worked in were the same ones that American farmers had tilled for generations. Over time, a strange kind of coexistence developed. Farmers who had once cursed the thought of enemy soldiers in their community began to depend on their labor. Conversations started, hesitant at first, then more frequent, as both sides realized they shared more in common than they imagined. A German soldier who had once shouted commands on the battlefield might now be quietly milking cows on a Minnesota farm, his accent heavy but his hands steady. This story, often left out of mainstream history books, is not simply about logistics or wartime necessity. It is about what happens when enemies are placed face to face in conditions that strip away the battlefield and expose only the human being beneath the uniform. The United States hosted these prisoners because Europe could not. But what grew from that decision was more than a practical solution. It became a powerful reminder of the complexities of war. Within the fences of those camps, men who had once fought for ideologies now lived in an environment where survival depended not on violence, but on cooperation. Looking back, it is striking to see how a logistical challenge too many prisoners in Europe, not enough space to hold them, turned into a human story that touched thousands of lives. For Minnesota, It meant sharing fields, food, and even fragments of daily life with men once labeled as enemies. For the prisoners, it meant seeing America not as a faceless opponent, but as a place where even in wartime, humanity could surface in unexpected ways. And for history, it left behind a chapter that forces us to consider how the treatment of those we capture reflects not only on them, but on ourselves. This was the hidden reality of the war, unfolding not on the beaches of Normandy or in the ruins of Berlin, but in the quiet towns of the American Midwest. Here, on soil far removed from the thunder of artillery, the United States carried the weight of responsibility for men who had once been sworn to fight against it. It was a responsibility born of necessity. Yet it became something more profound, a lesson in the enduring power of human dignity, even in the most unlikely of places. When the first groups of prisoners arrived in Minnesota, they stepped into a world far removed from the destruction of Europe. But their existence was quickly defined by work. The United States had not brought these men across the ocean to sit idly behind barbed wire. With so many American men gone to the front lines, entire communities faced an urgent shortage of labor. And the strain was felt most deeply in the agricultural heartland, farms that had once relied on sons, brothers, and fathers to plow the fields and bring in the harvest suddenly stood vulnerable. Crops ripened under the summer sun, but there were fewer hands to gather them. The solution, though unconventional, soon revealed itself in the rows of men wearing simple uniforms marked with "Pew Prisoner of War" letters stitched across their clothing. These men, once soldiers for the Axis, now bent their backs beneath the Minnesota sky, working the land of their former enemies. It was a strange arrangement, born out of necessity. The Geneva Convention permitted prisoners to be used for non-military labor, and in the fertile soil of the Midwest, there was no shortage of tasks to be done. They pulled weeds, chopped wood, drove tractors, and worked side by side with American farmers who had little choice but to accept the help. At first, the sight was unsettling for local families who had lost loved ones to the fighting overseas. Watching German soldiers hoist hay bales or dig irrigation trenches felt almost insulting, as if the enemy had somehow infiltrated their daily lives. Yet hunger and hard reality softened resistance. Without the labor of these men, much of the state's agricultural output would have suffered, threatening the food supply not only for Minnesota, but for the troops fighting across two oceans. The prisoners, for their part, often approached the work with surprising diligence. Many had grown up in rural Germany, familiar with the rhythms of the land, and quickly adapted to their new roles. They found a strange comfort in the predictable cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting, compared to the mud, blood, and chaos of the battlefields they had left behind. The endless rows of corn and sugar beets represented something far more stable. There was a measure of dignity in being useful again, even if it was under the watch of armed guards and within the confines of captivity. Some even wrote home to their families describing how they worked in fields that stretched farther than the eye could see, astonished by the scale of American farming. For the farmers, these men became less like faceless enemies and more like workers who happened to speak another language. At first, conversations were cautious, little more than nods or simple gestures exchanged over a shared task. But as weeks turned into months, barriers began to weaken. A farmer might show a prisoner how to operate a piece of equipment, or a prisoner might demonstrate a method he had learned in Germany for mending tools. Slowly, trust began to take root, and what had begun as an uneasy coexistence started to feel like a partnership of necessity. Stories spread of German prisoners singing folk songs as they picked apples, their voices carrying across the orchards, catching the attention of children who listened with wide eyes. In some towns, the sight of these men stacking hay or cutting timber became almost ordinary, a quiet reminder that even in the middle of war, life carried on. There were still fences and guards, of course, but within the daily rhythm of farm work, the lines between captor and captive blurred ever so slightly. For the prisoners, the work was not without hardship. The days were long, the tasks demanding, and the sense of displacement never fully left them. Yet compared to what they had feared when captured, starvation, brutality, or neglect, the reality of their situation seemed almost merciful. They were fed, housed, and given the chance to contribute, even in a land that had every reason to despise them. Many recognized the irony. The same hands that once loaded rifles and carried grenades now hosted baskets of potatoes and guided plows. The impact on the local communities was undeniable. Farms thrived despite the absence of so many American men, ensuring that food reached both the home front and the battlefront. Children grew up remembering the tall, foreign men who spoke with thick accents, but who helped bring in the harvest that kept their families fed. And in some households, gratitude slowly replaced suspicion. Farmers who had once cursed the idea of enemy soldiers in their fields later admitted that, without their labor, survival would have been far more uncertain. This arrangement also had subtle but lasting effects on the prisoners themselves. Working side by side with Americans allowed them to see a different image of the country they had been told to hate. They witnessed generosity in the form of shared meals or small acts of kindness. Like being handed an extra blanket during a harsh winter night. They came to understand that beyond propaganda and battle lines, ordinary people were not so different from themselves. This realization planted seeds that would outlive the war, as some prisoners carried memories of Minnesota's fields with them long after they returned home, shaping how they spoke of America to their families and communities in post-war Europe. The fields of Minnesota thus became more than a place of labor. They were a stage where the contradictions of war played out in everyday tasks. Men who had once stood on opposite sides of a battlefield were now linked by the shared responsibility of sustaining life. The harvests gathered by their hands filled not only silos and barns but also bridged a gap that ideology had once seemed to make impossible. It was an arrangement no one would have imagined at the start of the war, yet one that proved essential, both practically and symbolically. In the end, the use of prisoners of war in agriculture was not simply about keeping farms alive. It was about demonstrating that even in captivity, even in the shadow of global conflict, human beings could adapt, contribute, and find meaning. Minnesota's farmers and the prisoners who worked beside them were bound together by necessity. But out of that necessity grew moments of understanding that transcended the walls of the camps and the divisions of the war. And in those long days spent beneath the wide skies of the Midwest, with soil on their hands and sweat on their brows, the story of how enemies became laborers, and sometimes something more, was quietly written into the fabric of American history. By the time the prisoners settled into their new lives in Minnesota, their existence was shaped not only by the demands of labor, but also by the framework of international law that governed how they were to be treated. The 1929 Geneva Convention, signed years before the world had even imagined the scale of the Second World War, dictated that prisoners of war were entitled to human treatment. This meant they were to receive adequate food, proper shelter, medical attention when needed, and even opportunities for education and recreation. For the men behind the fences, this arrangement created a strange duality. They were captives in a foreign land, watched by armed guards and cut off from their families. Yet at the same time, they found themselves living with a degree of dignity that they had not expected. The provisions of the convention were not abstract promises. They became part of the rhythm of daily life. Meals were regular and sufficient, often plain but nourishing, designed to sustain men who spent long hours working in the fields or repairing equipment. Many prisoners, accustomed to rationing and shortages in war-torn Europe, were astonished at the consistency of food on American soil. bread, potatoes, vegetables, and occasionally meat gave them a sense of stability. And some even wrote home about how they were fed better in captivity than their families were back in Germany. It was a bitter truth that gnawed at them, for while they ate in relative security, they knew their loved ones were struggling under the weight of bombings, scarcity, and uncertainty. Shelter, too, was basic but steady. Wooden barracks lined the compounds, equipped with bunks, stoves, and modest furnishings. Winters in Minnesota were harsh, and many prisoners had never experienced such biting cold. But the camps provided enough protection from the elements to keep them alive and working. The guards and administrators understood that healthy prisoners were more useful than sick ones, and maintaining their well-being was both a humanitarian obligation and a practical necessity. Medical care was provided for injuries and illnesses, and although resources were not lavish, the very act of being treated by American doctors left a lasting impression on many of the men. For soldiers conditioned to expect cruelty if captured, the reality of receiving medicine, bandages, or even surgery in enemy hands was nothing short of astonishing. What surprised them most, however, was how the camps went beyond mere survival. Education and recreation became central to daily life, offering both a distraction from the monotony of captivity and a glimpse of a world beyond the war. Classes were organized for those who wanted to learn English, improve their literacy, or study practical skills they might use after the conflict ended. Some men who had left school early found themselves reading books again, their evenings spent bent over borrowed texts instead of cleaning rifles. Others discovered new talents, sketching in notebooks or practicing music on instruments provided through Red Cross programs. Quiet evenings, the sound of a harmonica or a violin could be heard drifting across the camp, mingling with the laughter of men playing soccer or organizing theater performances. Recreation was more than entertainment. It was a lifeline. Games of soccer and volleyball brought energy to otherwise weary days, while theatrical performances gave prisoners the chance to escape, if only briefly, the reality of confinement. Some plays were written by the prisoners themselves, often filled with humor that poked fun at their situation or with longing for home. These cultural expressions became a way to preserve identity, to remind themselves that they were more than numbers in a camp ledger, that they were still men with voices, stories, and dreams. Even the guards sometimes gathered at the edges of these performances, unable to resist the draw of human creativity breaking through the barbed wire. Not every moment was harmonious. Of course, tension simmered within the camps, especially between men who still clung to hardline loyalties and those who simply wanted to endure their captivity without further conflict. Yet the structure provided by the Geneva Convention gave administrators a framework to prevent brutality and to encourage order. Instead of descending into despair or chaos, the camps functioned with a sense of routine, one that allowed both prisoners and guards to navigate the strangeness of their circumstances. For many prisoners, these small mercies reshaped how they understood their captors. They had been told that Americans were ruthless enemies. Yet here they were given books, balls, and instruments, alongside food and shelter. They were treated not as faceless enemies to be crushed, but as human beings whose lives still carried value. This did not erase the realities of war or the fact of captivity, but it softened the bitterness, leaving behind memories that would complicate the way they thought about America long after the war ended. Some men later confessed that this treatment influenced their willingness to surrender. Word spread among captured soldiers that life in American camps was not one of torment but of survival, perhaps even a chance to outlast the war. In this way, the Geneva Convention and its enforcement by the United States became not just a moral stance but a strategic tool. Humane treatment undercut enemy morale, making it easier for Allied forces to accept surrenders without endless bloodshed. It was an example of how compassion and practicality could intersect, altering the course of the conflict in ways that statistics alone could never capture. In the cold mornings of Minnesota, as prisoners rose from their bunks to face another day of labor or study, the rules of the Geneva Convention were not abstract lines in a treaty, they were lived realities. A plate of food, a visit to the infirmary, a soccer ball kicked across the dirt, or a quiet hour with a book were daily reminders that even in captivity, their humanity was not erased. And for the Americans who guarded them, upheld the rules, and even joined in the occasional game, these small acts were proof that a nation could choose dignity over degradation, even toward its enemies. Thus, the story of Minnesota's camps is not only about men working in fields or adjusting to a foreign land, but also about a framework of decency that shaped their days. The Geneva Convention, written in peacetime, found its full meaning in the unlikely setting of wooden barracks and barbed wire fences scattered across the American Midwest. In honoring its principles, the United States not only sustained its prisoners, but also defined a legacy that endures, the conviction that even in the fiercest of wars, humanity can and must prevail. For the men who found themselves behind barbed wire on American soil, life was not solely defined by the loss of freedom or the memory of distant battlefields, because within the structure of these camps, a surprising world of culture and human expression emerged that allowed them to find a measure of purpose and dignity, even as prisoners of war. Camp commanders, influenced both by the Geneva Convention and by an understanding of human psychology, permitted the establishment of activities that went far beyond the bare necessities of survival. And slowly these places evolved into microcosms of life that carried traces of the societies the men had left behind. Sports fields were carved out of empty spaces, and soon competitions sprang up that drew crowds of both players and spectators, where the energy of soccer matches or the precision of volleyball games became a reminder of normalcy and community. Music, too, filled the air, as talented prisoners formed orchestras and choirs, fashioning instruments from whatever materials they could find, bringing a sense of rhythm and harmony to otherwise monotonous days. In some camps, evenings resonated with the sound of violins, accordions, or brass, as musicians played both classical pieces and folk songs from their homelands, blurring the line between captivity and cultural continuity. Art played an equally profound role, with workshops springing up where men sketched portraits, painted landscapes, or carved figures from wood, channeling not only creativity but also a longing for expression that transcended the fences. Some of these works became so accomplished that they later found their way into local communities, where townspeople came to admire or even purchase them, bridging a gap between the prisoners and the American civilians who lived just beyond the camp boundaries. Theater productions also became an outlet, with POWs writing, directing, and acting in plays that entertained their fellow captives and reflected their resilience. For a few hours on stage, men who had marched under foreign flags were simply characters in stories that spoke to universal human experiences. The importance of these cultural activities went deeper than mere diversion, because they helped preserve morale and identity in a time when both could easily erode under the weight of confinement. Sports competitions gave structure to time, music provided comfort, art captured hope, and theater encouraged camaraderie, all of which worked together to create an atmosphere that balanced discipline with humanity. For the American officers overseeing the camps, such programs reduced tension and minimized unrest, while for the prisoners they were lifelines that reminded them of who they were beyond uniforms and numbers. Stories survive of men who, after returning home years later, still remembered with fondness a particular song they had sung in a camp choir, or a painting they had created under a watchtower's shadow, evidence that these activities etched lasting impressions on lives caught in extraordinary circumstances. What makes this chapter of history so compelling is not only that it reveals a softer side of wartime captivity, but also that it reflects the resilience of the human spirit, showing that even within fences and under guard, people will find ways to create, to compete, to share, and to hold on to fragments of culture that make life meaningful. The American policy of permitting and even encouraging these pursuits illustrates how the rules of war, when applied with respect, can lead to unexpected outcomes that enrich both captors and captives. Local communities occasionally attended exhibitions or concerts put on by the POWs, creating rare moments of shared humanity across divides of nationality and conflict. In these moments, the camp stopped being a symbol of defeat and instead became a stage for the endurance of art, sport, and imagination. The legacy of these cultural endeavors can still be traced in anecdotes, preserved artworks, and the memories of those who witnessed them, standing as a reminder that war, though capable of immense destruction, cannot entirely strip away the need to create and to connect. It is this ability to find humanity in the unlikeliest of places that transforms the history of POW camps in America into more than just a footnote about logistics or compliance with international conventions, but into a testament of how culture sustains life, even in captivity. When the first groups of Axis prisoners were brought into rural America, many local civilians viewed them with suspicion, a mix of unease and resentment shadowing their presence. Because these men were not abstract figures in a distant war, but actual soldiers from the armies that had once threatened loved ones overseas. Families who sent sons to Europe or the Pacific sometimes found it difficult to accept that enemy soldiers were being housed nearby, fed, clothed, and even allowed to play music or stage theater in camps that stood only a few miles from their homes. The initial reaction was often one of guarded distance, whispered worries in town halls and quiet prayers at dinner tables, as residents tried to reconcile their patriotic duty with the knowledge that former combatants were now laboring in the same fields or repairing fences on neighboring farms. Yet over time, as the seasons shifted and the war stretched on, something unexpected began to unfold, because daily encounters between prisoners and civilians slowly gave way to recognition of shared humanity, and walls of mistrust began to crumble in places where cultural ties and practical necessity drew people together. Farmers, particularly in the Midwest, came to rely heavily on the POW labor that filled the gap left by men fighting abroad, and working side by side with the prisoners inevitably created moments of conversation and exchange. Small at first, but enough to plant seeds of understanding. Many towns in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas already had deep German heritage, and older residents often spoke the language fluently, which became a bridge across what once seemed an unbridgeable divide. It was not uncommon for a farmer to hand a German prisoner a sandwich or a cup of water after a long day's harvest, or for laughter to erupt when words failed but gestures communicated simple human needs. Children, initially warned to stay away, sometimes found themselves watching soccer matches between prisoners or listening from a distance when music drifted from the camp, and gradually fear gave way to fascination, then to acceptance. Communities that once bristled at the thought of housing the enemy began to notice that the prisoners, for all their uniforms and foreign accents, were men not so different from their own brothers and cousins. Some were young and homesick. Some were skilled tradesmen who could fix machinery or craft furniture, and others were artists or musicians who brought unexpected beauty into the drab routine of wartime life. A bond slowly developed in places where exchange became part of daily rhythms, whether through the simple act of trading a smile, the more complex act of shared labor, or the profound realization that the enemy was not always the caricature painted by propaganda. Trust was cautious, but it grew, especially in towns where the heritage of shared language and customs allowed for conversations over fences, fleeting friendships in fields, and moments of kindness that both sides carried in their memories long after the war. In many Church communities quietly played a role, with ministers reminding their congregations of moral obligations, and some even allowed prisoners to attend Sunday services under guard, where hymns sung in different accents resonated with the same spiritual conviction. The blending of cultures created unexpected harmonies, and stories spread of townspeople attending art exhibitions organized by the prisoners, or of local musicians joining camp orchestras for a night of music that transcended barriers. Such interactions did not erase the reality of war, nor did they diminish the grief of families who had lost loved ones. But they demonstrated how people can reconcile contradictions, holding both loyalty to country and compassion for individuals within the same heart. By the time the war drew to a close, many communities had transformed their view of the POW camps from places of suspicion into spaces that left behind surprising legacies of friendship and mutual respect. Farmers remembered the extra hands that saved their crops. Children remembered the foreign songs they heard through fences, and prisoners carried back to Europe memories of unexpected kindness in a land once painted as an adversary. These stories reveal that history is never just about armies and governments, but also about ordinary people who find ways to bridge divides in the midst of conflict. The wary stares that once greeted the arrival of prisoners eventually softened into nods of recognition, and in some cases, enduring friendships were born from these unlikely encounters. What began as an uneasy experiment in hosting captured soldiers ended as a testament to the possibility of human connection, even in the most unlikely circumstances, and it is precisely in this transformation that the story of POW camps in America finds one of its most compelling and enduring chapters. As the years of captivity unfolded and the seasons passed, the relationship between the prisoners of war and the civilians around them deepened in ways no one could have imagined when those first convoys of captured soldiers rolled into the American heartland. What began with suspicion and a wary distance slowly evolved into familiarity, and from familiarity, bonds were formed that sometimes reached far beyond the fences of the camps and endured long after the war itself had ended. The prisoners, once regarded as nameless representatives of an enemy machine, revealed themselves as individuals with faces, voices, and stories, and as the boundaries of daily interaction expanded, they became part of the rhythm of American communities in subtle but undeniable ways. Letters became one of the most powerful symbols of this transformation. When the war was over and the prisoners were repatriated, many carried with them not only memories, but also the addresses of American families with whom they had built connections. These correspondences were more than polite exchanges. They often contained reflections on shared labor, recollections of meals taken together, and even photographs passed across oceans to remind both sides of the friendships that had formed in the shadow of war. Some American families, touched by the humanity of the men who had worked in their fields or crafted gifts from scraps of wood and metal, continued to write for decades, bridging continents and ideologies with words that carried warmth across the post-war divide. For former prisoners, receiving these letters was often a reminder that not all of America was defined by conflict and barbed wire. There was also kindness, generosity, and acceptance. Experiences that lingered long after they returned to nations ravaged by bombings and defeat. Within this web of connections, some stories carried even greater intimacy. In a few rare and remarkable cases, romantic bonds developed between the prisoners and local women, a testament to the unpredictable course of human emotion, even in the most unlikely circumstances. While strict rules and social expectations often kept such relationships hidden, there are accounts of quiet exchanges that blossomed into something deeper, moments when compassion and curiosity crossed into affection. A prisoner might carve a small trinket as a gift, or a young woman might slip a book or a note into the hands of someone whose foreign accent intrigued her. And from these gestures, connections grew that defied the barbed wire meant to separate them. For the women who risked gossip or judgment, and for the prisoners who dreamed of futures far from their camps, These relationships embodied a fragile but powerful resistance to the divisions imposed by war. The correspondence and romances that survived the end of captivity were not simply personal stories but reflections of a broader truth about how people navigate the contradictions of conflict. Families who had initially feared the presence of enemy soldiers often found themselves recalling them fondly once they were gone. And communities where bonds had formed sometimes welcomed letters that arrived months later with news from across the Atlantic. For the prisoners, the friendships and romances they carried home became evidence that the enemy they had once been taught to despise could, in fact, be compassionate and generous. And these revelations influenced how they spoke of America in the years that followed. In some cases, these bonds even led to extraordinary journeys after the war. A handful of former prisoners returned to America as immigrants, drawn back by the connections they had formed and the memories of a land that had offered unexpected humanity during their captivity. Others reunited with families they had written to for years, stepping once again into towns where they had once been watched with suspicion but were now welcomed as friends. These stories, though few in number, highlight how deeply transformative those wartime encounters could be, reshaping not just individual lives but the cultural memory of entire communities. The letters, photographs, and keepsakes preserved from these relationships serve today as quiet reminders of an era when lines of barbed wire could not fully contain the complexities of human connection. They tell us that even in times of total war, when governments clashed and propaganda painted the enemy in the darkest possible light, individuals could still look one another in the eye and see not an enemy but a fellow human being. They reveal the resilience of the human spirit, its ability to reach across divides and to transform captivity into something more than survival. The lifelong correspondences and romances remind us that history is not only written in battles and treaties but also in the quiet moments of empathy, laughter, and affection that slip through the cracks of conflict and linger far beyond the end of war. As the decades rolled on, many of those who had once lived behind fences in the American Midwest grew old in their homelands. Some with boxes of letters tucked away in drawers, yellowed with time but still carrying the voices of friends from across the ocean. For the American families who kept writing, those letters remained a cherished part of their own family histories. Stories retold to children and grandchildren about the time when enemies became companions, and companions sometimes became something more. It is in these stories that the legacy of the prisoner of war camps truly comes alive, because they show us that even amidst war's brutality, people can choose to build bridges instead of walls, connections instead of divisions, and memories that endure longer than any battle ever could. As the war pressed on and the world was torn apart by destruction, the way the United States chose to treat its prisoners of war became not only a matter of necessity, but a deliberate choice that carried far-reaching consequences. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners received food, shelter, medical care, and the chance to engage in cultural and recreational activities. And while these standards may have seemed like simple obligations on paper, in practice they reflected something deeper, a conscious decision to uphold dignity in the face of conflict. For German and Italian soldiers who expected to be brutalized or left to waste away in misery, the reality they encountered was strikingly different. They discovered an America that, while firmly committed to defeating them on the battlefield, chose to extend compassion once they were captured. This human treatment produced an unexpected ripple effect on the course of the war itself. Reports spread quickly among Axis troops that surrendering to the Americans was far safer than resisting until the end. Instead of facing starvation, disease, or cruelty, those who laid down their arms often found themselves housed in camps where they worked, learned, and even discovered a strange sense of normalcy despite their captivity. In this way, America's adherence to the higher road became a quiet but powerful weapon. weakening enemy resolve and encouraging surrender at moments when fighting to the last man might have otherwise prolonged the war and deepened its toll. The decision to respect human dignity, even in the heart of conflict, not only aligned with international law but also served as a practical strategy that saved lives on both sides. But the impact of this choice went far beyond the war itself. For the thousands of prisoners who eventually returned home, their time in America became a reference point for the rest of their lives. Many spoke to their families and communities about the unexpected kindness they had encountered, sharing stories of working on American farms, learning new skills, and even building friendships with people who had once been their sworn enemies. These testimonies slowly reshaped perceptions, softening the image of America in post-war Europe and planting seeds for the alliances that would define the decades to come. Some of the men who had once fought against the United States returned years later not as soldiers, but as immigrants, seeking to rebuild their futures in a land that had shown them humanity when the world around them seemed consumed by hate. In this light, the prisoner of war camps scattered across the American Midwest and beyond stand today not as forgotten relics but as symbols of a profound lesson. That how a nation treats its enemies says as much about its character as how it treats its friends. The barbed wire and guard towers may be gone, but the legacies of compassion, fairness, and connection still linger in the memories, letters, and stories that have been passed down. These lessons remind us that the pursuit of victory does not have to strip away the values of decency and humanity, and that sometimes strength is shown not in cruelty but in restraint. As we reflect on these hidden chapters of history, it becomes clear that the story of Axis prisoners in America is not just about war, but about the choices people and nations make in the darkest of times. It is about farmers who looked past uniforms and saw workers, about children who learned to wave at strangers across fences, about prisoners who returned home with memories of compassion in a foreign land, and about the enduring truth that kindness, even in, can have consequences as lasting as any battlefield victory. These stories challenge us to consider the world we live in today and the ways in which humanity can still triumph over division, even when fear and conflict threaten to overwhelm it. And so, as we close this chapter of Untold History, I want to thank you for taking this journey with us, for listening to the voices of the past and helping to keep alive the lessons they carry. If you found this story meaningful, if it challenged the way you think about history or opened your eyes to the human side of war, I invite you to support our work. Please give this video a like, share it with others who are curious about the past, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss future explorations of history's forgotten corners. Every gesture of support helps us continue uncovering the stories that too often remain hidden in the shadows. Together, we can keep these memories alive and remind ourselves that even in times of great darkness, there is always room for compassion, dignity, and the choice to take the higher road.